Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our spring book webinar, where we have the honor and privilege of hearing from Dr. Elizabeth Conde-Frazier, who will be sharing with us about her book, Listen to the Children. Elizabeth, would you like to say hello to the group?
Good evening to everyone. Thank you for taking the time this evening to have this conversation. It's a conversation of my heart, and I hope that it is yours as well.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, so much for being here, spending time with us, and sharing about this book that I have here, Listen to the Children, Conversations with Immigrant Families. This is a book that was written, I think, at the 2011, right? Around then, 2010, 2011. And it's a wonderful resource just for the church to really begin to think through the conversation of immigration from the perspective of the children and what is best for those young children themselves who find themselves in these situations, as well as those who begin to settle within local churches, and how do we best serve and love and care for the children in our midst. I love this book for many reasons, but one of my favorite reasons is that if you hold it in this position, it is in English, and if you flip it over, it is actually in Spanish. So you actually get two books in one if you get this book, which is amazing. There's not a lot of I don't think I've ever seen a book that did that before. Once again, it's here in English and then here in Spanish. So if you know somebody who prefers Spanish or prefers English, this book is available for everyone. So yeah, I'll go ahead and read a quick bio of Elizabeth for those of you who may not know her. Dr. Elizabeth Conde-Frazier is the director of the Association for Hispanic Theological Education. Prior to this role, she served as the Dean and Vice President of Education at Esperanza College of Eastern University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Conde-Frazier has authored this book, Listen to the Children, Conversations with Immigrant Families, as well as other books such as Hispanic Bible Institutes, and she's co-authored books such as A Many-Colored Kingdom and Latina Evangelicas. She has over 10 years of experience and has an ordained pastor and formerly served as a bilingual teacher in the New York City school system. Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Frazier holds a PhD from Boston College and a Master of Divinity degree from Palmer Seminary. So we are very grateful and thankful, Elizabeth, for your time, for joining us. And if you could, maybe for the next 10, 15 minutes or so, really share with us maybe some of your reflections of introducing this book to us, why you wrote it. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have to say, this book was written as a community, as a response to a community of persons. I did a conference in North Carolina with a bunch of churches, and we were talking about similar topics. I was with them for a couple of days, and it was more about the conversations that we had at the table as I sat at the table with families and I noticed the children and I'm talking to the parents and so on and so forth. And at the end of that conference, a group of persons sort of came at me and cornered me, and they said, Hermana, we need you to write this book. We need you to write a book that helps us as families to be present to our children because they've been through this journey of immigration with us, and we need you to write this book. And that stayed with me as a call from God. I really, really felt that deep in my heart as a call from God. And so as I was on the plane going home, I started to write the book. I started to write the book in Spanish because this was going to all of my Latino church members who had been there. And after about a week of writing in Spanish, I realized that I couldn't continue writing in Spanish because Spanish is the language of my heart and my soul. And I spent so much time just crying and crying and crying while I was writing the book because it went so deep into my heart. And so I moved into the English so that I could get my thoughts out. And then it came forth. It was a book that I wrote not for scholars. but it's a book that I wrote for the church, for a pastor, for a Sunday school teacher, for a mother. It's a book that I wrote for teachers in the school system who are going to be working with our children and who have a heart for children. It's a book that's written for anyone in the system that is going to be touching the lives of immigrant families, but particularly of children, so that we would all have a sense of how children are affected by immigration. And as I speak to you tonight, I'm aware of the fact that in 2022, the Department of Health and Human Services reported that nearly 130,000 unaccompanied migrant children entered the U.S. shelter system. Now, of course, we know that many more than that were part of coming into this country. These children came mainly from Central America. About 47% of them came from Guatemala, and they're in the care of these shelters about 30 to 102 days. And then they're released to a family member or to a sponsor while they await immigrant proceedings. And right now, if you're close to Florida or you have churches that you know are close to Florida, the governor of that state has declared some really draconian measures and has eliminated shelters for children and not allowed and made it almost, wants to make it almost a criminal act if churches open up shelters for children and are in their presence and accompany them from one space to another. And so if you are in that state, please write letters about this piece. You can look at Evangelicos for Social Justice online, and they have a whole section where you can see more information and register with them. So let me just quickly, I just read a short portion. This is Emma's story. The book looks at different stories, and as you look at the narratives, it then discusses them, breaks them down, and then gives the reader some of the tools for knowing what to do. Emma was 9 when her mother immigrated to the United States, leaving her with her tia, Ruthie. A loving and caring woman, Ruthie lavished attention and affection on Emma in her mother's absence. For 3 years, Emma enjoyed not only her tia's love, but the money and gifts that her mother sent, which allowed her to have things no other child in the barrio had. Tia Ruthie taught Emma to share generously with other children, but even Ruthie's own children thought that Emma had become spoiled. When Emma turned 12, her mother sent for her. Emma was at first excited to be reunited, but she soon discovered that life with her mother was different than she'd remembered, and very different from life with Tia Ruthie. Mama worked long hours, and Emma had to cook and tidy the house before her mother got home. Emma was not allowed to leave their small apartment after school to play with friends, as she did back home. And in fact, she had no friends. The girls at school dressed in a way that Tia Ruthie would say wasn't ladylike, and they made fun of Emma for being different. When her mother came home, Emma rarely wanted to talk, so after dinner, Mama would send her to her room to do homework. If Emma had a question or finished early, she would find her mother sleeping on the sofa in front of the loud television. They did not communicate. Emma used to have long talks with Tia Ruthie while Tia cooked, did laundry, or watched the younger children. But Emma didn't know how to share with her mother. Mama wouldn't share how homesick Emma was anyway. She just wanted her tia. Emma wrote many letters to Tia Ruthie and her friends, but her mother complained about the cost of so many stamps. And every day, Emma became more isolated and depressed. And one day, her emotions exploded. So then it goes on to show the interaction that happens between Emma and her mother. And you see everything that Emma's been holding in her heart, and you see how the relationship between them has broken apart. And then the book discusses how a church or how families that are in contact with Emma and her mother can help.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That is powerful. That is very, very powerful story for us to reflect on and to think about. Many times we don't realize these dimensions of the immigrant narrative and the immigrant experience and the things that children face in the midst of it. So thank you for introducing us to those concepts and those stories. Um, we're at this time we're gonna have an opportunity for you all to ask questions of Elizabeth if you'd like to kind of explore this topic more with her. I'll go ahead and ask her a couple questions just to initiate this time together. However, feel free to write something down. If you have a question, you're welcome to raise your hand here using the Zoom feature, and we'll go ahead and unmute you so that you can share. But kind of just to get the questions kicked off, Elizabeth, what have you found most valuable in centering the voices of immigrant children in conversations of immigration?
The most important thing has been the awareness that it has raised for Sunday school teachers, especially. Parents sort of know this, but reading the book gives parents an opportunity to have a real discussion. Some churches have opened up to having discussions, and that has really helped as families to discuss some of these pieces together, because it's difficult for you to raise this issue by yourself and to say, oh, I'm Elizabeth and I really would like to discuss X, this is happening in my family. But they're able to discuss the narratives that are in the book, and through the narratives to sort of share. And again, churches pay a lot of attention to adults. When you go to an agency, they're paying great attention to adults. And schools will understand that children are going through things, but unless they have someone like Felisa Roman, who's here this evening, and she's a social worker at a school, and she would understand what the issues are about, unless they have someone who's as talented as she, schools don't necessarily know what to do. And this book, in a very simple way, has helped people to look at it. Something I didn't expect to see is that as different Bible institutes have used the book, people who've gone through this journey themselves have, even as adults, have found that, again, the book allows them a space for talking about what happened in their own childhood or as a family. And just the opportunity to open the subject and to begin talking about it, I think is the biggest piece that has taken place.
Oh, that is beautiful. Yeah, no, I'm just thinking how this resource is something that can be used on so many different levels, and how you shared that you wrote it for the local church. And as it is a resource for the local church, but that's also being used for local Bible institutes, how do you think local churches can begin to address these types of needs and concerns of immigrant children themselves in spaces like their Sunday services, during worship, or those that are part of their local communities? How can the church begin to come alongside and serve them in a holistic way?
I would say that there are different tasks of a church. And before you move into the worship, which is usually the central piece that people see, begin to open up in times of fellowship. Usually fellowship happens around food, and we're very non-intentional about what happens during that fellowship time. We need to become more intentional about how we design the time around the table. And we can be more intentional by looking at who sits with who, having people talk about different subjects, etc., having poetry, having narratives such as this one being read, and beginning to open up the subject. The other thing is that the church that engages its community becomes aware of what's taking place in that community, and we can begin to look at information from just our everyday engagement with the community, and to say, what is it that we're finding, what's taking place? And then to sort of ask, what are the resources that are present in this community, and what are the resources that are lacking, that are missing in this community. But to know who we could refer families to create relationships with those institutions and so forth, so that our church can work in collaboration with others.
Mhm.
And then we begin to use the teaching and the preaching of the church. And that then becomes a space where we can have immigrant families write psalms. Psalms were ways of engaging God, and we can use those psalms in our worship. We can write songs, and we don't, it's hard to think that we're singing songs that are translated from somebody else's culture and therefore not contextualized enough. Songs that there's nothing wrong with talking about me and God, but we have to talk about how we relate to each other and to our struggles. Songs that talk about God and our struggles, and that talk about where God brings hope into our struggles, and then more particularly into the struggles of an immigrant family. So we need songs like that. And I believe that in our churches, there are people who are talented enough to be able to make that happen, right? We can use drama during our worship time. And that's even more powerful, perhaps, than a usual type of sermon, right? And then there's the part of our ministry that we don't always think about. It's new to us as Latinos, and that is the prophetic side of the ministry, the side that the evangelical people are using right now, that where they're protesting, where they're going to the courts of the king, they're going over to Tallahassee, which is their capital in the state, and they're protesting. And if you can't march, you can write a letter. And believe it or not, letters are very significant in that process. We've had conversations with legislative folk, and they will say, I hear what you have to say, Reverend, but I have all these letters here, and you'll see sacks of letters sitting in their office. And these letters are telling me to do quite the opposite of what you're telling me. And yet your narrative is very compelling. How am I going to make the case? Well, we got to write our letters too. And so the church needs to ask, how is it that we create these spaces? I see in the chat that Liz, who is a professor in the area of liturgy, has said that children can write songs too. And yes, they absolutely can. And, those songs will come to children very naturally. So incorporating these things, just open your mind and say, God, where are the spaces that we can create as a church? More importantly, sometimes one church feels at a loss as to what she can do with all of the complexity of issues that can come together. And here is where we really need to think as a body of Christ. And we need to think about how we fellowship with other churches, how our leadership gets to know the leadership of other congregations, so that together in a particular community, we can collaborate. When a church collaborates with another church body, that's when we are co-creating with God in that community. And it's that co-creation that opens up the space, abre una brecha, and you have the kingdom of God in our midst. I cannot say enough about how important that is, because when we do that, now we have a space, a God space, where together as different churches, we can create the kinds of projects that are so important for people to be able to come together and meet the needs of children and families.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even like with many immigrant churches, I've heard in the past that oftentimes while they don't have the most resources, they know how to use the resources that they have well. And they're able to stretch every penny, and they're able to do things at a level, and just the amount of work that could be done if people really came together. And I think as you shared, I think it's just beautiful, the idea beginning to incorporate these types of things into worship and really making it part of the liturgy of the church. I think the idea that God is present within the immigrant stories, the stories of immigrants themselves and their journeys and how God is with them and caring for them, and that God has something to say in those stories. He has not abandoned them. I think it is a way of just instilling human dignity and empowerment to these local communities that is often desperately needed in these spaces, and for especially for the children.
The whole piece about the value of the person is how the book ends. It talks about worthiness, yeah, about worthiness. It's a very short piece, but it's a very important piece because immigrant families are looking for a sense of being valued in their own countries. They're not because of the situations that they've been living through. They come to this country hoping that they're going to find that sense of worthiness, and then they don't either. And so they're caught up, right? And they're families who have so much to give. They're families with a tremendous work ethic. They're families, persons who value what they encounter when they come. Many of us take those things for granted here, but they don't. They don't take anything for granted. And all that they seek is a space for their own human dignity, their sense of worthiness. And so how does the church help to make that a space where they can feel worthy? They can feel worthy. When we sing, "Worthy is the Lamb," we have to be able to also sing, "Worthy is the immigrant in our midst."
Amen. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. Wow. So at this time, let's go ahead and open it up for questions here in the room. I see we have a couple here in the chat, so we'll go ahead and start there. And if anybody else here has questions, feel free to raise your hand and you can unmute your mic when it's your turn and engage directly. So we have a question here that was sent privately, Elizabeth, and the question is, what are the sensitive things that the church needs to handle delicately? And how do they do that?
Yes. Sometimes traumatic things happen on the journey, and children witness those things, or children become recipients of those traumas. And we need expert help in dealing with them. And we need to have a protocol. We need a protocol in our churches for how we handle these matters. So, for example, someone may come to you with a prayer request, and I believe that we should have intercessors who are designated by the church, and that people know that they come to those intercessors if they have sensitive things, and then that those intercessors and the pastor have a protocol for how it is that information is shared only within that group. And then from the pastoral side, we then have a way of doing the referral and of managing the sensitive pieces. The church should also know enough about the law, about what are the things that we need to absolutely report, especially when a child is involved. And a church should have a way of keeping all of their children safe, because you don't want a child to have to go through more trauma on top of what may have been there. I learned from one pastor that during the pandemic, not only did they have online services for the adults, but she would weekly have an online time to share with the children, and she would send packages to their homes so that they could do arts and crafts and that sort of thing. If the story was shared, they would have the pictures and all of that. But she would start the time as the children came on to just ask them how they were doing, what was happening. And the children, she found in her own congregation, had stories to share during that time that they had never shared before. And that opened her up to the immigrant stories of her children. And that was important. I think that as pastors, many times we relegate our children to others, and usually to women in the church. And pastors need to be the pastors of their children, directly be the pastors of their children. Know the names of your children. Know what's happening in their lives. Have real conversations, not cutesy wootsy little conversations with them when you see them at the door. ¿Cómo tú estás, mijito? I see, que bueno, Dios te bendiga. You know, not those kinds of conversations. That's not a real conversation. You want to have children really communicate. By the time they're 3 and 4, they can really express their feelings. They can really tell you stuff. And you should have real conversations with your children. Hear what it is that they really want to say to you. And if a child feels cared for by someone, they will share with you. They will definitely share with you. So pastors need to know their children and have spaces, open spaces for their children to be able to share. And that helps to open up a pastor's heart. And if that pastor is working collaboratively with other churches, then we're able to directly help a child. Parents may many times be in denial about certain things, but children are going to come right out and tell you. Some children have witnessed sexual abuse or have experienced that. And we need to be able to help them. Some children have experienced seeing someone pass away on the journey because it was too cold in the mountains, or someone drowned or something like that. And they need to be able to make sense of what that means and to talk about it. And when children are separated from parents, it's very difficult for that child to reunite with the parent, because many times the parent was not able to say to the child, this is, mijito, I have to leave. This is why I'm leaving, etc., etc. And children create other narratives in their minds, and they have a lot of anger toward a parent when they're reuniting. There's just a lot that happens because that bond has been interrupted. And so they need to have someone that they can talk to. And I believe that pastors need to be able to do that with their children, as this pastor that I was speaking about was able to do.
Absolutely, thank you. And I've also reflected on this notion of when children were being separated at the borders a few years back. We have yet to see the consequences on the emotional and the traumatic and the psychological toll that has taken upon a generation of youth and immigrants. And we as the church should know that that's not over just because that law is no longer in place, or it might be in place soon again with what's happening right now with legislation. But just because things have changed it that way does not mean that the repercussions of those things hasn't changed. And really empowering local churches to think about how can we respond holistically to those emotional and as you said, those traumas in which people experience, and help them work through them is something that is so essential that the church can help resource.
One thing that some churches have done is to prepare themselves as foster families, not to allow a family or two to do it on their own, but to make this a ministry of the church, which means that not all families will be able to become foster families, but the other families can come alongside and be supportive of those that are. There are many ways for us to be supportive. And so as they go through their training, for the other families to be able to be supportive to them. And those children know that don't romanticize that time with the child. Know that this is actually the times when children are going to be acting out. When children are, especially because they've been through trauma, and children are going to be acting out that trauma and so forth. So it's going to be very difficult, very stressful for a family to take in a child that's been through this time. And so we need to come alongside of families who've been who've become foster families. And I think I just saw a snippet of something that someone wrote in the chat precisely about that.
Yes,
Thank you for your comment.
Lois just sent us a link here to an organization a ministry that helps families in the church come alongside other foster families. So that's a
Thank you,
beautiful.
Lois.
We have another question here, and then we'll see if anybody else in the room has a question that they'd like to ask. This question is from Patricia. She asks, should this book change the emotional resilience of immigrant children and their families? How can we apply this in our churches? Which I believe you've kind of touched upon the second question.
So let's talk about resilience and let's talk about thriving. Resilience is usually a good thing. Resilience means that a family is able to find strength and flexibility. You need flexibility as well to be able to adapt to a new environment, to be able to get back on their feet, to be able to go through the adaptations that are necessary, the healing, etc. And it means that they have that strength and that flexibility to do that, that they're able to approach challenges with a positive attitude. When a church is able to help a family do that, the church needs to approach it through what are the messages of hope that can be helpful to a family, hope and strength. And we're not talking about fluffy hope, but we're talking about hope that comes because you truly understand what the struggle is. So it's hope that comes from the struggle. It's a realistic hope, right? It's not a pie in the sky kind of a hope, but it's a realistic hope, right? And the more that churches are able to have that message of hope before the families, before those who are going through this time, the more important the church then becomes as a larger family, as a larger extended family. The church then becomes a force with a message of hope, and hope helps resilience. What you don't want is where people hide their real feelings because they're supposed to look like they're strong, right? Sometimes strength is not like, yeah, que estoy en la lucha, that kind of thing. Sometimes real strength is that you can fall apart, that you can cry, because real strength comes from our weakness, because in our weakness, then Christ becomes strong. And so that we can be truthful, that we can be authentic. If we're having a hard day, that we can say, man, I've had better days, kind of thing, right? And that we can be truthful. So that's real versus the fake mask that I put on because I'm supposed to be, victoriosa en el Señor, you don't want that. And then you want to be able to move slowly toward thriving by providing resources that people need to be able to reestablish their lives. And so there are many resources that people need to reestablish their lives. And it takes 3 to 5 years to just establish yourself, to just sort of, be in a more comfortable place. And by the time a family moves into their 6th, 7th, 8th to the 10th year, then they need other resources for another level of adaptation. And so know what are the different resources at different points, know how families who are further along can be of strength and hope to families who've just arrived, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I appreciate you making that note of that unconditional positivity that often exists within a lot of churches that can be harmful in some ways. It's a matter of discipleship that we need to work through those things as well. That Christians go through victories, but they also go through valleys, they go through deserts, and it's okay to feel and to work and process through those tough emotions and work through that together as a community. So, and yeah, so thank you for mentioning that and for also outlining for us kind of what that process of walking with people through this journey in different phases. Those who are in different phases, what does it mean to help them and serve them as they go through their journey. So we have another question here in the chat. This is a slightly longer one. So what do you imagine it looks like for churches to address, well, the realities of parents and children being separated by borders, immigration long term? Specifically, if one or both parents have immigrated to the US, while some or all of their children remain with other family members in their country of origin. And if the children reunite with one or both of their parents in the US after a long period of separation. So it sounds somewhat of like the story that you were telling earlier. What does it look like for churches to care well for the families in their congregations when all the members of the families are not able to be present in that church's space due to complexities related to their immigration stories?
So first of all, know who the part of the family that is with you, who they are, and be present to them. Then as you find out who is not there, find out how that part of the family relates to this family here. Find out what's happening in those relationships or not happening, right? And help to make communication take place. Communication is very important. So help to make communication take place. The other thing is if families, because families go through crisis while they're apart from each other. And so that communication will be even more important then. But also, sometimes it's not possible for a family member here who may be differently documented to go across and be back where family is there. How do you help to bring closure for them? How do you help them to express what's happening and so forth? Like the death of a family member there. How do you help them to go through that part of the whole ordeal of that? And if you can connect with a pastor who is back home, that's even better, because then pastor to pastor, you're able to work out different rituals that need to take place and so forth. So that's an important piece, is the communication and how you try to find resources on both ends while that's taking place. And then you have to deal with the realities, help parents deal with the realities that if they're going to be away that long, that they have to renegotiate what that relationship can and can't look like.
There's a lot to think about and in process there. Thank you, Elizabeth. Lois here asks, can you briefly comment on chapter 5 of your book about the family's legal status and how that affects children? Also, do you have different approaches to individuals with official refugee status, say from Afghanistan, Ukraine, the Congo, Syria, the Rohingya, etc., and those families coming from our southern border without official refugee status? What are the unique differences in ministry to these children?
So every country is different. And the reason for that is there are cultural differences, and we have to be aware of what is culturally significant to a people and what is not. So what might be a good way to relate culturally to a family as a church may be different between Latino cultures and African cultures, for example, right? So know the culture. Know the culture. You can't just answer this question, with a blanket statement. We have to know the culture. And according to those particularities, we contextualize what takes place. We also contextualize how the Bible has meaning for them. What are the stories that will have most meaning? What are the stories that will bring hope? how does counseling take place or not take place with a family, right? And then legally, there are differences as well for each of those countries and the relationship that they have or don't have with the United States. So we have to become aware of those real differences when we're trying to design a way of ministering to them. I usually try to find folk who are from that culture with whom we can work together. I wouldn't just venture in there like, here I come to save the day. Mighty Mouse is on her way. I wouldn't do that. I really would. It's better to pause and to become informed before you go in and mess things up, because this is about trust. And if you mess up trust, then it makes it harder, not just for you, but for someone else who could come and help. So don't mess up trust, become informed. Legal status and how it affects children. I'm going to talk about the Latina community because I understand more about that context. But children are taught by their parents what their boundaries are, what their limits are and aren't. And so immigrant parents, in order to protect their children and to protect the family, have a whole host of things that they do in the name of protection of the family, and therefore inform what are the boundaries or the limitations that we have as a family and so forth. Children try to become helpers in that, and that's part of a child's work. Immigrant children work. They work in schools because schools don't always understand how to help the other children. And children help their teachers. Children help their principals. They do work. And so children also help their families. And there are different ways in which children try to help their families. And in so doing, they may take on more responsibility than they need to. And that then squelches their ability to be children and to enjoy what it means to be children. So we need to become aware of that. And we need to be able to allow children to be children when they are in our spaces at church. So churches obviously need to be safe spaces, so families feel safe enough to relax and to allow their children to be children in that space. That's really important. The other thing is that let's talk about teenagers, because teenagers are very industrious persons. They can now think abstractly, and they begin to imagine other lives for their parents, for themselves. And it's very difficult as a teenager to realize that you have un futuro negado, a denied future. Because it's the time, from the time that you're like in 7th grade and so forth, is a time when you start becoming aware of who you are, what your gifts are. You want to explore what that is about, and you want to explore how you can make contributions in the world, because now you can see the world. Now you can see others, and you can see yourself as opposed to others, and now you can see yourself in the world, and you begin to imagine what that is or isn't. And it's very difficult to imagine what that is when you don't have that status, and you therefore can't move in the same direction that others can. And so, again, having conversations to think about what are the alternatives that our families may have who don't enjoy the same status as others, and to imagine where those young people can go and so forth. And this is absolutely why a church needs to have a dimension of their ministry as a prophetic dimension, because we're not going to be able to move those limits. We can't remove them. We can't do anything with them truly except work within them until we get this country to respond in dignified ways to the needs of immigrants and to open up to the contributions that they can truly make.
Wow. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. You have given us so much to think about, so much to wrestle with, and so much to take home with us to our local churches, to our local congregations, of what it means to serve well and to serve faithfully. Those that we find in our midst that are often overlooked or not really thought carefully about how we can care for the children in our midst. For Jesus, children were so precious. He said, "Let the children come to me, for theirs is the kingdom." So also we should be willing to welcome and embrace those children and care for them in that way. So, as we finish, Elizabeth, do you have any parting words with us as we leave from here? We're going to put a link for the book in the chat if anybody's interested. What is your hope, Elizabeth, that we do as we engage with this work, or as we engage with this book, and then begin to do this work within our local communities?
That we really listen, that we really do listen to the children, that we become the pastors of our children, and that we collaborate. We cannot do this ministry as churches alone. We have to be able to collaborate. So please look at each other on the screen. If you've not shown your beautiful face, please do so for a minute, and connect with each other. You're all persons who are part of the kingdom of God, and let's continue to bring the hope of the Basileia of that kingdom to our children. God bless us all in doing that.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Elizabeth. So, yeah, thank you for your time and for sharing your wisdom with us. Let's give her a round of applause, actually. Thank you. Thank you for this.